Hi, and welcome back to my shop. If you'll recall back to the first episode in this jewelry case project, I went through and cut the main components for the primary case. And I went with mitered corners because my client doesn't want to see any end grain and they want the case to be as clean as possible. And I mentioned that mitered corners on their own are not strong enough to make up a case. So in this episode, I'm going to show you how I'm going to reinforce those corners. Now, just a quick refresher on glue joints before I get into the construction of my reinforced miter joints. The strongest glue joint you can have is long grain to long grain, like this. And in theory, a long grain glue joint is actually stronger than the material around it, especially if you have nice straight grain. Now, end grain does not take a glue joint well at all. So either end grain to end grain like this, or even end grain to long grain in a butt joint like this, will not be sufficient to just use a glue joint. You'd have to mechanically reinforce that joint. Now, we're in sort of a special case where I've got a miter, and you've kind of got half long grain and half end grain in a miter joint. So technically, that's going to be a slightly stronger glue joint than just end grain to end grain or even end grain to long grain. But it's still not strong enough on its own. And so we need to do a mechanical joint in addition to the glue joint to make that nice and strong. Now, to reinforce a miter joint like this, we have a couple of different options, and both involve splines. Now, a spline is just a thin piece of wood that adds increased glue surface to the joint. One way I could do this is to cut a slot or a groove along the outside of this joint and then slide that spline in there, and that would reinforce it. And if I had a taller joint, like in the back of this case, I could put 2 or maybe 3 splines to really add some significant glue surface. But in this case, my client really wants to keep the box as clean as possible and really focus all of the attention on what's going to be inside the case. So what I thought I would do is go with an inside spline. So what I've done is I've cut grooves on the inside of the miter, and that's going to basically create a mostly concealed joint. Now this is my spline right here, just another piece of walnut, and it just slides in and will create both a mechanical joint because it's physically holding the joint together, and it'll add additional long grain to long grain glue surface. Now, the other advantage to using an inside spline joint like this, once I get to gluing up, that's actually going to greatly assist me in clamping once I get the glue on these joints. Now, I've found that really the only way you can effectively make those splined cuts here is to use a jig on the table saw. I suppose you could also do something similar on the router table, but I've found that I get a pretty good result using the table saw. First, I have one of my outer wings for my dado stack set in the table, and there's really 2 reasons behind that. One, it's almost a full 1/8 of an inch wide, so I can use a more durable spline. But secondly, the teeth of this blade are ground flat on the top. So that gives me that nice square top to my spline cut. If I were to use a regular alternating tooth blade in the saw, you get that sort of signature V shape at the top of that kerf, and it actually leaves very small triangular gaps at the top of the spline, so I wanted to avoid that. Now, this jig was fairly easy to build. It took me about an hour and a half, and it's mostly made out of Baltic birch. And all it is a piece of birch on the front and the back that sit on top of a piece of 1/4 inch MDF. And then I just have 2 45-degree triangles cut out that support it from underneath. And I also have a fence attached to it, which keeps my stock completely square to the table and also extends all the way down so that I actually have sort of a sacrificial fence at the bottom there. And that keeps me from getting any blowout when the blade exits the back side. And in order to make this a little bit more adjustable and to keep it completely square, I've also attached it to my miter sled, which gives me some flexibility. Here's a rear view of the sled assembly, and you can see that I just have my miter gauge set on the table, and then the jig is just clamped onto it. So this accomplishes two things. One, it keeps the jig completely perpendicular to the blade. And secondly, it allows me to move the entire jig in and out, and then I can clamp it down. And that's what lets me adjust how far along that miter I'm actually going to cut the slot. Now I have this slot set so that there's just barely a shoulder on the back of that miter, and that gives me the longest possible or deepest possible slot for the spline to sit in. I have this set pretty deep, and it almost looks impossible, like that this would still hang on, but it is strong enough to hold, and once I put the glue and get everything clamped up, it's all going to hold together nicely. So I'm going to show you the sled in action, first with the front piece of my box. This is fairly straightforward. All I have to do is slide the piece up against the fence and then slide it down so that it sits flush on the top of my table saw. Now I want to make sure that I'm doing this on the metal part of the table saw, not on the insert here, because I want to make sure that it's perfectly aligned with the flat surface of the tabletop. Then I'm just going to put a little clamp on the top, and that will keep the piece from sliding up and down as I push the sled through. And I'm also going to use a push stick or a push pad here, and that's going to just ensure that I keep the piece registered against this fence and against the top of the sled. And it also keeps my fingers nice and clear from the spinning blade. And then all I have to do is push it through nice and slowly. And there you can see the nice groove. I have one slightly added complication when I get to the side pieces, because they have that slope on the top. So if I were to feed this through, I would have that slope to contend with. I don't want it to sit against that slope. I want it to sit completely perpendicular to the surface of the table. So what I did is I created a second stop here, or basically an addition to my fence, and it's just a wedge that perfectly matches this same angle. And I've put a miter on the bottom of it, and the kerf you see there will serve as kind of that backing piece against the walnut, again ensuring that I don't get any blowout. So it's a little bit more involved, but I just slide that wedge down so that it sits on the bottom of the table, and then slide my piece up against it so that it also sits perpendicular. And then I'm again going to be using my push pad and that gives me my spline cut on the sloped side. On the mating sloped side, I have kind of a similar problem with just a slight difference. In this case, the wider side of the slope is actually sitting on the bottom. So in this case, my wedge just needs to flip over and slide in to take up that extra space, just to keep the piece completely perpendicular to the table surface. All that's left now is for me to get my spline stock cut. Now I have lots of good cutoffs left over from when I had to dimension the walnut in the first place, because I had 4/4 inch stock coming down to 1/2 inch. So I've got some pretty good material to work with. So I'll just joint it and then send it through the planer to get it close, and then I'll use the drum sander to fine tune it so I get a nice secure fit. Then lastly, I just need to fine tune the width of my splines. You can see here, I still have a little bit of a gap because it's still a tiny bit too wide. So I'll just fine tune that on my table saw. And then the last couple millimeters, I'm just going to fine tune using a hand plane. It ultimately took just 3 passes on the hand plane to get it perfect. So I have no gap on either side of the spline and no gap along my miter, more importantly. Here you can see the dry assembled version with the splines holding the corners in place. Obviously I've left these splines long because I'll ultimately use my flush cut saw to trim them down after I've glued everything up. In the meantime, for the next steps, I'm going to need to fit the top, and I don't want these splines sticking out the top, so I've actually cut some smaller ones that I can bury inside, so it'll still kind of hold the dry assembly in place but allow me to fit my measurements and do anything else I need to do until the final glue up. But basically the joinery for the corners is done, and now I can start working on the lid.